Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome, Ms. Taylor, we live. We're online, so welcome to anybody out there in the internet watching us for our Representation Review Committee meeting. A karakia I have found on the Otago University website. Tukua te wairua kia reare ki ngā tamata, hai araha I a tātou mahi, ti tā tahu wai inga tikanga a rātou mā, kia mā ki tia, kia kiore a nahara, naro, kia pupuri, kia whakamaua, kia tina, ue tau heki e. And a translation for that is allow one spirit to exercise its potential, to guide us in our work as well as in our pursuit of our ancestral traditions. Take hold and preserve it. Ensure that it is never lost. Hold fast, secure it, draw together, affirm. So we have an apology for lateness from Mr. Morton. Everybody else appears to be here. Do I have a mover and a seconder for that apology? I'll move Mr. Miller, Councillor Miller and the Mayor. All those in favour, contrary, carried. Confirmation of the minutes of our last ordinary meeting held on June 23rd. Moved, Councillor Gallagher. Seconded, the Mayor. Is there any discussion on those minutes? If not, those in favour that they be confirmed, please say aye. Contrary, carried. My report. Since our last meeting, we've had our drop-in sessions. They were, on the whole, poorly attended. But I do thank those members who came to those meetings. There was an interesting range of discussion from those people who did attend. From one gentleman who thought democracy would be better served if we had 15 councillors, so there were more councillors, to one who said that he would rather we had 7 because that would be fewer councillors to argue with. So a wide range of views were expressed. We seem to have had a reasonable number of online submissions, which we will consider later. We tried, and I thank you, Stephen and Murray, and the other staff who supported that. We've certainly tried to offer the community the opportunity to engage. It lay in their hands, and mostly they chose not to. I move that my report be received. Seconded, the Mayor. All those in favour? Contrary, carried. The next item on our agenda, item 7 on the diligent one, is the Māori ward and constituency process. I'll hand it over to David or Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the background to this process is explained in the report, but it's essentially a consultation process that is being run by the Department of Internal Affairs. It's actually the second stage of a process for reviewing the processes relating to Māori wards and constituencies. The first stage earlier this year involved the repeal of the poll provisions, which provides for members of the public to request a poll in relation to a council's decision to establish or not establish a Māori ward. So following that stage, the department is now seeking further feedback from the community and from councils as to proposed changes to its processes for the timing and the mechanisms for the establishment of or the consideration and establishment of Māori wards and constituencies across all local government in New Zealand. And so they circulated a discussion document which is attached to the report, and the feedback was sought on 6 key areas. 6 key questions were posed through that document, and those 6 key areas were the requirements for councils to consider ward systems, the timing of any decisions, so looking for some alignment in particular in terms of timing, opportunities for public input, what would be the role of the local government commission in decision making, how and when Māori wards might be discontinued, and the types of polls that councils can hold. And they propose that these changes would come into effect after the 2022 elections, so they would be in place in time for the 2025 elections. This consultation closes towards the end of this month on the 27th. A relatively short time frame for consultation, so in order to expedite the process of considering a submission or feedback on those questions, a working group which comprised the chair of the subcommittee, Councillor Epiha, the chief executive, and myself, have reviewed the document, gone through those questions, and formed an initial view as to the responses to those questions, which are set out in the body of the document in front of you. And we place those before the subcommittee for your consideration, and would look for the response or any amendments to this response to be recommended to the council as our submission on this consultation process. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Is there feedback from committee members as to the working group's responses to those questions?
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to say I'm disappointed with the fact that the whole subcommittee was not given the opportunity to have input in this. We are a subcommittee, not a subcommittee, but I just want to make a point that what has been put forward has not been put forward by all of us discussing it together.
Thank you. Now is your opportunity to discuss it. Have you comments that you believe that the working group's view differs from what you would have said?
I think it's something like this. We all need to have discussed it together to hear everybody's views, just not a few members.
Thank you. Other comments? Councillor Miller?
I guess you put me on the spot, Mr. Chairman. I don't see any problem with the work that the subcommittee has done. I think it's answered the questions that have been asked of it by the Minister. But I suppose if I was to, you asked me a question, like philosophically, I'm fundamentally opposed to there being any wards based on being required to be of a certain race to be elected. I've said that before. I just think it's a very poor direction to have a selection based on race. I think New Zealand's heading in the wrong direction if we continue that policy. It's controversial, but it's my philosophy. I just cannot see that this is the way forward.
But within that, if that is the system, did we reflect?
So I said, if that's the system, you've answered, the questions have been answered well.
Thank you.
Yeah, just say thanks for the work to do it. And as I read through, I thought the answers reflected trying to treat everyone as equally as could be, and that if we're making decisions for one part of the system, it should be reflected across the whole system, and it was good. So thanks to those that put in the work to come up with those answers.
Okay.
Kia ora, tēnā rā tātou. I think the key word here is that there was a short time for consultation, and that's literally what's happened. If there's any engagement to be done, I would have thought it would have been by the entire population. However, this is a consultation document for council, and given the questions that we've answered, it's aligned a system that currently exists to a more democratic position that allows for greater engagement from all of our community. I can understand both sides of the table here, and respect Councillor Miller's views, and also Councillor Gallagher's views that we weren't, the entire subcommittee were involved in the discussion, so it's a little bit awkward to have that discussion now. I think we've had the information in front of us long enough to make the view, and I do respect Councillor Miller's discussion there, but I think the work that's come out of it aligns our district towards a better future that allows for greater engagement with our Māori population.
Any other discussion? Would someone like to move the recommendations? So moved Councillor Epiha, seconded the Mayor. All those in favour? Contrary carried. Move to our next item on the agenda. Page 28, item 8, and diligent. Report on preliminary consultation. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this report is the first of the substantive reports for this meeting to consider, and it's designed to inform the decision that this subcommittee needs to make to develop an initial proposal to recommend to the council to take out for formal public consultation. So this report summarises the findings from the preliminary consultation that has been undertaken over the past month, and works through the responses to the questions that were posed in relation to the 4 options that were set out in front of the community for their feedback and comment. As the chairman has noted, public meetings were not well attended. Numbers were very limited, but there was a good quality discussion at a number of those meetings, and we did receive a number of written feedback forms as a result of holding those meetings. So it certainly did assist in the engagement. So looking at section 3 in this report on page 30, just run through what preliminary consultation was undertaken. The consultation was open from the 5th to the 30th of July. We had all of the information available online through our engagement website. Printed material was widely available through our council premises, service centres, with the drop-in sessions, and there was a workshop with the Melbourne Community Board. We promoted the information through a variety of channels, which are set out there on page 31. And the locations of the drop-in sessions are noted there as well, noting that West Melton was a particular focus for one of those meetings, given that was potentially one of the affected areas. So a total of 106 submissions were received. 79 of these were submitted online and 26 were on printed forms. All of the information was entered into the digital system so that we could conduct analysis on the findings of the community feedback. And we just make the point there, noting that this consultation is non-statutory, so no formal hearings are required, but the information is here for your consideration. And so I just want to also draw your attention to section on page, back to page 30, just the guidance from the Local Government Commission on this preliminary consultation, which points out that the public feedback assists the council to make its decision, but it is not guided or held to, and there's comment further in the report that we are not necessarily held to the findings of the community feedback, but it is important as informing the process and getting a gauge from those who have contributed to this process. So starting on page 32, you can see the findings of the preliminary consultation. And chart 1 shows the key responses to the 4 options that were presented. So option 1, attracting around 26% of preferences. Option 2, 3 wards with 10 councillors, attracting around 30%. And option 4, 4 wards with 7 councillors, attracting around 24%. So those 3 within a fairly close grouping. And then option 3 being somewhat lower than the other responses in terms of preference. There are some of the little bit of the commentary is included there, and we've also included all of the verbatim comments in the report as an attachment as well, which is there for your information. We note that there was also some comment on page 33 of the report. There was certainly comment from some people raising the issue of the cost, even though it was pointed out to people in a number of cases that having fewer councillors would not necessarily result in lower costs for ratepayers, but it's an issue that continues to come up and be raised. Some commentary there about some of the views that appear to be coming through in part of this process, and I suppose an overall impression from respondents' comments is that they are looking for a reasonable number of representatives, either councillors or community board members. Although the most preferred individual option was a 3-ward option in total, it was really only slightly more respondents than those preferring the 4-ward options, and if you combine the 4-ward options, they again slightly outnumber those that went for the 3-ward option. So a number of ways that you can look at those figures, and I'm sure you've taken the opportunity to have a look at those. Page 33, halfway down on chart 2, looks at the question of the percentage of respondents who were wanting a community board in their ward. So just bearing in mind that when we went out with the survey, the decision was that we would not offer any specific community board options or scenarios, but leave the question relatively open and let people give a comment along the lines of, for the ward that you would find yourself in under your preferred scenario, would you want to have a community board? And so the responses set out in that chart, 62% indicating yes, 38% indicating no. The chart on the top of page 34 indicates a breakdown of those community board preferences analysed by which wards or which options for the wards those respondents took. So the option for 4 wards with 7 councillors, for example, the bottom one of those graphs shows the highest proportion of people selecting a preference for a community board under that option, as opposed to a couple of the other options with a fairly somewhat lower preference. In the 3 wards with 9 councillors, also a high proportion. And chart 4, down on the bottom of page 34, shows a breakdown of those community board questions by the ward or proposed ward that the respondents would be in under their preferred scenario. We'll come to community boards in more detail shortly, but just note on section 5 at the top of page 35, we do have to, as part of this process, consider community boards, and there are some options that are presented in the subsequent report, which has been circulated and updated this morning with some new data, and we will have maps available for you to look at as well. So in terms of the next steps, we note that the committee's role now is to consider the public feedback, but in particular to take account of those key principles that the legislation sets out of communities of interest, effective representation of communities of interest, and fair representation of electors, and also taking account of the feedback from the public as part of this process. This needs to be recommended to the council. Our timeline currently is that this would go to the full council meeting of the 25th of August. We would publicly notify the initial proposal on the 3rd of September, public consultation opening on that date and running through the month of September and closing on 4th of October. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll throw it open to the committee. Welcome, John. Sorry about the confusion of the starting time. But you've made it for the meat and the sandwich. The first of our reports considering which of these 4 options, or as Mr. Hill has pointed out, any other option we want to take back to council as our preferred option for council. So I'll throw it open for comment from the committee as to what we're looking for at the moment is, of the 4 options we went out to consultation with, which should we take forward as the selected option. Would we go around the room, starting with Jenny, Councillor Gallagher? Well, yeah, yes, from this report, or from, if you'd use your mic so that people are on the.
Interesting feedback for the number that wanted community boards. To me, the decision really needs to be made around councillors before we make the decision on community boards. So it's a bit difficult at the moment, I feel, to give my answer to.
Well, we're looking at the ward and councillor option at the moment. We'll come back to community boards once we've settled on one of a ward option.
Okay, so the ward option that I like is option 2.
Thank you. Any particular, do you want to make any comment why option 2 over the others at all? You don't have to.
Well, when you look at things, the option of putting West Melton in with Melbourne is considered one of them, but really West Melton and Rolleston tend to go together. With changing of Rolleston, a lot of the students now go to schools in Rolleston, and people do not go to Darfield to the like they used to. So I think we need to keep those two townships together. So yes, that's my preferred option at the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Miller?
I discounted the 2, 7 and 9 on the basis that the feedback was relatively strong that both Ellesmere and Melbourne required at least 2 councillors. So I think that was quite easy to get that. Then got the last 2 options about whether it's a 4-ward or a 3-ward option. I had a great deal of thought on it, and given the very, very low turnout at our drop-in sessions, I spend a lot of time talking to people in my local community. So this is the Springs ward view. The Springs ward view, in my view, is that the 4-ward 10 councillor works better. The rationale behind that is that although perhaps in the past, at least in Lincoln, would be seen as communities of interest, both being rural villages, Lincoln has moved somewhat from that position. It is increasingly an urban population with large and dormitory suburb of Christchurch, much like Rolleston. And while it's, for want of a better word, certainly has a lot of friendship ties with Ellesmere, probably doesn't see the community of interest that was there in the past. I think if you were looking at the future, and I think we're tasked with this 6-year period, but I think we should look into the future, it is blatantly obvious that Rolleston will continue to grow and will require more councillors in the future. So I think the saying "not now" for West Melton is a bit naive. I think we should bite the bullet and move West Melton either into Melbourne now, with the potential at the next representation review it may become a ward in its own right. But I don't see the logic really of keeping West Melton within Rolleston, given the expensive growth we're going to have there. So I'll talk further about community boards because I do have feedback from our community about community boards as well, but I'll just stick to that at the moment. So 4 wards, 10 councillors.
Thank you. Councillor Ebihar. Oh, sorry, John. My apologies, Mr. Morton.
If I make the first comment to the group here after reading the report and listening to the backing to Stephen, we're not exactly overwhelmed with guidance, are we, from the submissions, which is extremely disappointing, but probably was the reality, and we knew that was probably going to be the case anyway, which you could only draw the conclusion that people are quite happy with whatever and really don't care. And if they did care, they'd make a submission. So they are happy to let the group make a decision, or maybe they're going to keep their reactions or their comments to when council adopts something and it goes back out again. I think, correct me, Stephen, I heard you say that the subcommittee is guided by the submissions but not bound by the submissions, which is rather interesting, isn't it? So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So now that then it falls back on your own research or your own individual views when you sit around the group here. And I personally could see both option 1 and 2 with West Melton in Melbourne or outside Melbourne are both workable. I lean slightly towards the second option where West Melton isn't in with Melbourne because maybe that's been parochial or maybe that's been history. That would mean that that ward was a purely or truly a rural ward without too much of an urban population in it. That might be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your view. So I am torn between option 1 and option 2, and we're going to come back to community boards because I think it's pretty obvious. You could also have the view that if you had the community of West Melton in the Melbourne ward, the representatives might get a bit more of a balanced view from their ratepayers because they would get both a rural perspective and they would also be a bit closer to the urban growth. So there may be some advantages. So having nicely sat on the fence there, which is probably not my style normally, I can see that we could meet the community's needs with either option 1 or option 2.
But if you have to express a preference, and I prefer you express one option.
Okay,
to assist
I will express a preference then. I would prefer to see West Melton not in the Melbourne ward.
So option 2.
Option 2.
Thank you. Now, Councillor Epiha.
Interesting. I think I was on the fence as well, John. Up till when you gave your discussion then. Obviously, I can speak for the Ellesmere ward, and what we're seeing in Ellesmere is a significant amount of growth. And over the next 5 years, the population will grow by 50%. Now, the concern and while there was low turnout for the representation drop-in centre, actually all of the chairs turned up to those meetings for the community committees, or most of them did, and gave their opinions. What they're most worried about is representation itself. So losing a councillor or having the ability, I guess, for under the new election, given one of those two options, to lose representation or to have representation from further out of the ward, perhaps would see them with less. They were concerned about that, and just given the amount of growth, really wanting to see good, solid Ellesmere representation. I'm in favour of option 1, given that and given the feedback from my community. And I'll leave it at that for now. It's a community board today.
Thanks for all the feedback that we've received around the table this morning and people's views. I think it's just interesting to know that we're coming to different spaces, and it's been very hard without much guidance from the community consultation. It's been good those that have engaged with the process, but yet it's very hard to put a whole lot of weight on that as being the general community feel beyond those 100 people. So I find myself then coming back to thinking about what's good and bad, and what, as Grant has said, conversations that we've had around the community. What are some of the things that sit with the history that I know of the areas, and then thinking about the future and the direction that we want to go. And to me, option 1 has Rolleston urban as small and tight as a ward as possible. I like that going forward. I think that actually having the views from a tight urban centre around Rolleston makes sense. But option 1 has a massive Ellesmere area digging out to Kiwi. So I'm like, there's some good and there's some negative around option 1. Option 2 has got a much extended Selwyn Central wards that brings in West Melton, and I'm not so fussed on that. I think that the smaller Selwyn Central ward is a better thing, and it also, the 3 ward option brings together Springs and Ellesmere, and I don't feel that we've had a really strong view either way around whether that's a good change to make or not. So option 2, there's good and bad for. Option 3 has a smaller Rolleston ward, which I like, but then still brings together Springs and Ellesmere, and perhaps there's, again, I haven't had strong feedback around whether actually bringing them together is going to be good or bad. In option 4, I think there's more bad than good. Getting down to one councillor, I didn't hear any support really for going down to one councillor in Ellesmere or Melbourne. So while that does keep our ward boundaries similar, I don't think that should be the one that we put forward. So my two favourites are option 1 and option 3. And if I'm going to have to choose one, I think we should probably land with option 1. But I don't have a strong view. I think as we've all said, and I wonder whether the process, maybe we go backwards and try and take out options, and I'm not hearing any support for option 4, and then think about how we narrow it down, because there's been 2 or 3 different options proposed around the table so far, and we need to figure out a way to get to the one that we're going to land on for where we go out. Well, Mr. Chairman, keen to hear your view as well.
Thank you. I land on option 2. I believe that option 1 fails on the communities of interest. I live in the area that with an option 1 would go from the central ward to the Ellesmere ward, and I would argue strongly community of interest that the area of Selwyn Central, that option 1 would move into the Ellesmere ward, have no community of interest with Ellesmere at all. The area around Kuwi may have a community of interest with Melbourne, which in fact that's where they end up in option 2. The area sort of south and east rather of Kuwi has a much more affinity with Melbourne than Ellesmere. I'm strongly against, in this model, a much reduced Selwyn Central ward, because I foreshadow that it would make it very difficult for the Selwyn Central ward councillors. They would have almost a completely urban and only urban focus, urban and industrial. The current model, and I believe option 2, will have all councillors a mixture of urban and rural. And that, in my view, it certainly assists me in my role as a councillor, having both communities in my ward that I have to work with and understand, both urban and rural. The much reduced Selwyn Central ward, while I hope that the councillors would still work with both communities, don't have to. I suspect that you will see around the council table a much stronger and more obvious urban-rural divide. I don't think it will make for a good council. So, and similarly with West Melton, I think the West Melton Township, as Jenny articulated, no longer associates with Melbourne. The people who've moved in the last 10 years to West Melton don't have an affinity with Darfield. They either look to Christchurch because that's where they work, or Ralston because that's where they shop, and that's where the children go to high school, and that's where they do a lot of their sports. They come to the facilities here. So it certainly is for me, and is that option 2. I agree, Sam, that perhaps it might be we have another go around and dropping out options. There is no support for option 4, I think, in the room, and there was little support for option 3 either in the community consultation. So it does become down to 1 or 2, but I really am concerned that option 1 fails the broader community of interest test, that we would be putting people into wards with whom they have no affinity. I, living on Two Chain Road, don't have an association with Ellesmere. I wouldn't naturally go to an Ellesmere ward councillor for any issues pertaining to me. My township of interest is communities of interest are Burnham and Ralston, not Leaston, Southbridge, Dunsandel. They simply are not. I would struggle to identify community leaders in the Ellesmere ward when it came to vote for councillors. As I've said in jest to Murray and Shane, as much as I like them, I really don't want to vote for or against them in the next election. My community of interest lies in the Selwyn Central ward. And I believe that is so for my neighbours and those in the area, though those to the western side of the Selwyn Central ward have had an affinity with Malvern, and I think that would work. So if we want to go that way, can I ask, would we generally agree that option 3 and 4 are off the table? Anybody who wants to retain either of those two options? No.
Well, I like option 3 better than option 2. so sit down option 2 wouldn't be my second choice, if you're asking the question.
Right, but if we have to start thinning the number of options down, Councillor Miller. Yeah, okay. Any other comments, or are you others happy to drop 3 and 4 off?
Well, should we drop 4 off for a start, and then think about what the next one is to drop off?
That would be the prudent process. And I mean, at the end of the day, the subcommittee's delegated responsibility to make a recommendation back to the council meeting, as Stephen said on the 25th of August. There's been a number of comments made about submissions and engagement. And before we get too concerned about that, cast your mind back to 2015 when we did our last representation review. The total number of submissions received through that process was only 1 different from the number of submissions that we had through this process. So that sort of indicates that level of engagement and the level of interest possibly. For me, the big issues going forward are around what is council going to be involved in? What are the big issues for council across its communities in the next 6 years? And we know about growth patterns, and we just reflect on where they're coming through the private plan changes. We note the changing demographics across Selwyn. We note the changing land use as well, and the expectation on us, and also through the future for local government. What are some of those issues and services that we may well be involved in delivering? We know Three Waters is potentially coming out on the 1st of July 2024, so what will that be replaced with? And therefore the community of interest and the expectation and engagement they'll have with council. So we're at 4. Should we try and get, as you were, we're at 3. Should we try and get down to 2 and then slog it out?
Okay, well, we perhaps take this more on in an STV proportional vote. Councillor Miller expressed his second preference is option 3. Sam, I think you said that your second preference were 1 and 3. Shane, if you had to choose an option apart from 1, what would your second preference be? 2. John, I think, did you express 1 and 2 were your 2 options?
Yeah.
Have you changed your mind at all in the last 5 minutes?
Which way around were they? Grant, you were 1 first and 3 second. Shane, you were 1 first and 2 second. John, you were 2 first and 1 second.
Grant is 1 and 3.
Yeah. John.
Or John, use the microphone if you want to have a comment, John.
Yeah, very interesting, isn't it? It's a compromise. I would have to lean towards 1 and then 2.
You're going 1 first?
Yep.
Okay. So you're 1 first and 2 second, Jimmy. You were 2 first and 1 second. Is that correct? You were 2 first. Come back to you. Sam, you were 1 and 3.
Oh, sorry.
Mark, you were...
I haven't expressed a second opinion yet.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I got myself a bit complicated. My first preference is not to have West Melton in my ward, so that's actually option 2.
Yeah, you're 2 and 1.
2 and 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair and.
Well, if I had to choose a second option, it would be 3.
So 2 was your first.
Yeah.
3 is
And
your
in option 3, because it at least partially addresses my community of interest concern. It puts the area at which I live within the Selwyn Central Ward, retains in the Selwyn Central Ward the area northwest of Whedon's Ross Road and Whedon's Road. More of that is retained in the Selwyn Central Ward. So it better addresses, in my view, my concerns about community of interest in terms of the Selwyn Central Ward still has a rural element. Its councillors will represent both urban and rural communities. And so I feel that better meets my community of interest. I still personally feel it fails West Melton. So my second preference would be 3-9, option 3.
We're just waiting for a second. Which one do you want me to write down? Okay, so if you just want to scribble these down, option 1, 3 first picks, 2 second picks. Option 2, 3 first picks, 1 second pick. And option 3, 0 first picks and 3 second picks. And that totals 12, and everybody's had 2 votes, so that's right. So option 1, 3-2. Option 2, 3 and 1. Option 3, 0 and 3. So you get a slight favourite chair there in option 1, and given that option 3 has got no first picks, it might be prudent just to park that at this stage and see if we can get to a recommendation for 1. And bear in mind that we are charged with making a recommendation to share this with full council next week, but in a fortnight's time. But by the same token, the subcommittee does need some conviction in front of council to actually sell the option that it is proposing to the group.
I'll add, if I may, one further comment. We did 2 drop-in sessions with the Melbourne Community Board. Their preferred option, and they didn't express a second, was option 2. For the reasons pretty much that Councillor Gallagher has expressed, that they did not see the urban West Melton Township of having a community of interest in their ward anymore. And they were also preferred, as Mr. Morton has said, a more rural, small community-focused Melbourne ward than including West Melton and its surrounding areas in their ward. So I guess Mr. Morton has expressed their opinions, but that was their preference of these options was 2, and I suspect John's right that 1 would have been their second option. So waiting to speak, Councillor Miller.
Mr. Chairman, I suppose there's a couple of things I'd like to bring up. Why I voted the way I did was because there's a clear differential between 3 wards and 4 wards. So in my mind, we should be debating option 2 and option 3 against each other to develop which is our preferred 3 ward option, and then debating whatever that is versus option 1. Because, as I said, my community of interest regards having 4 wards as desirable. And I know, Mr. Chairman, I must hold you to account that repeatedly you were talking about what's in it for me. where I live, what I want, rather
No.
than your ratepayers.
No,
And so
I will challenge you on that, Councillor Miller. I am saying what is in the representative of the residents in my area, which I believe is more or less the same words that you have used.
Yeah,
So
I'm not sure
so
that's
I
what I
would
was hearing, Mr.
challenge, I
Chairman.
challenge you that to accuse me of representing myself and not my community is in fact wrong. I am, in my view, representing the community in which I live, which I believe we all have. So I think we should park that disagreement and move on. I quite agree with you that we
It's
should
not the
have-
language you're using, Mr. Chairman, but I accept your explanation. So that's my position. I'd rather see us debate the 2-3 ward options or first come to a conclusion on them and then debate them. But that's only my view.
Others around the table, would you like to discuss which of the 2-3 ward options before we come to a final choice?
No, I'm just looking at the map again, and when I look at option 1, a lot of the lower area towards Burnham of Kirwee would associate themselves more with Kirwee than what they would with Ellesmere. So I'm looking at whether I should have gone with option 3 rather than 2 when you're looking at the area that you're trying to best serve your community.
So that's probably the opportunity you've got now if we go to Councillor Miller's suggestion and balance the 2-3 ward options. And Jenny, we can start with you. And I think.
Well, see, I think I put option 1 in as my second option, whereas now looking at the maps again, option 3 is a better representation for the areas rather than 1.
So of the 3 ward options you're talking, so we're talking about option 2 versus option 3 at the moment. That's the point we're discussing around the table.
Which,
and your preference is option 3, is that correct?
no, option 2.
Rightio, Grant.
No, option 3. If you're discussing the 2-3 ward options, I've already given my reasons.
Yeah, so you're a 3.
That's 3. Thank you,
John.
Well, I've been quite consistent about my view about maintaining the ward's rural feel or rural representation. And West Melbourne is very much the eye in the needle, isn't it, in this discussion, because it's the one that we're all focusing on and that's the one that's impacted. So obviously option 3 has West Melbourne in the Melbourne ward, where option 1 does not. And neither does option 2. So I can't, listening to my community, and you can't help yourself, you are expressing your own personal view, of course, as well. I don't see any favour in option 3 for that factor. But option 1, of course.
No, it's option 2 or 3 we're talking about, John.
Okay, well, I'm still favouring option 2.
Good. Shane?
Stay with 2.
Sam?
3.
Mark?
3. 2.
So that gives 4 votes to 2 and 2 votes for 3, which is consistent with the previous STV count on options 1, 2 and 3. So to repeat, option 2 for 4 of you and option 3 for 2 of you.
So you're saying we've got down to 2.
So if you accept that that's the guidance of the committee, you're now option 1 versus option 2.
Yep.
So
Can we debate the issue around West Melbourne? I think that's the second point that we've all discussed, and clearly I identify that I'm not in the West Melbourne ward at the moment, but I hark back to what you described, Chairman Morton of the Community Board.
You can address me anyway you like, I don't mind.
I don't use the word God anymore. That's quite good. I think there's value in West Melton being in Melbourne. I really do. I think that just that mix of slightly urban population would add value that you described in your conversation. I fail to see where we are addressing the future of our community if we put West Melton in with Ralston. When you see the growth that's predicted to occur under you and National Policy Statement Urban Development, we are setting ourselves up for further trouble, where at least we start a discussion in the next representation review about what that looks like. We are not thinking forward at all, in my view.
Can I then ask a similar question, Councillor Miller? Did you have a discussion in the southwestern portion of this current Springs ward, which under option 1 is proposed to go to Ellesmere? Do those people essentially from Springston west and south identify with Ellesmere over Springs?
If you look at Springston, it's a small rural village, and while it's closer geographically to Lincoln than to anywhere else, if you look at the population, probably in general they're more akin to an Ellesmere representation than they are to a Springs. But it's just a delightful piece of history that Springston identifies with the Springs ward, obviously from the name, and there's that emotional attachment. That's what it is.
Well, that argument can be then turned to the West Melton and say that actually...
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you can twist any argument the way you like to get your perspective, but I think that's very disingenuous of you to even attempt that.
No, it's not. Your argument was that the people south and west of
Mark,
Springston...
if you want to get in that path, let's book in 4 hours and we'll have a great old time. Let's get some progress.
No, I'm just saying that it was an interesting answer you gave. It can also be used for the urban township of West Melton, no longer identifying with Melbourne.
You could, Mr. Chairman, but I think that's a poor example.
So if I can just bring everybody back to the vote that we had. So clearly option 1 was the point scorer. That's a 4-ward option with 10 councillors. We then talked about options 2 versus option 3 as the best of the 3-ward options. 4 of you identified option 2, 2 of you identified option 3. So based on that outcome, we're now considering option 1 with 4 wards and 10 councillors, option 2 with 3 wards and 10 councillors. And just remind the subcommittee that we do require an outcome to recommend back to council on the 25th, where it will be debated one more time before we go to consultation.
So do we have to give 2 options to council or just one?
No, one.
We are required to give a single option to council to consider to take forward as its preferred model.
So based on the numbers that we've gathered around the table thus far, the favoured option, albeit only slightly favoured, is option 1. So the challenge, Mr. Chair, I think, is to ask what would the reasons for not putting option 1 forward be?
Well, as I've said to the committee, I believe that option 1 fails to address communities of interest well. And that is actually a significant consideration. If you look back earlier in our report, we have to consider communities of interest. And notwithstanding what Councillor Miller has said, I do not believe that the portion of Selwyn Central shifted into the Ellesmere ward in option 1 have a community of interest with the Ellesmere ward. And I do not believe that the West Melton Township has a community of interest with the Malvern ward. The rural areas of around West Melton and on the northwestern portion of Selwyn Central have more of an affinity with Malvern. The area of Selwyn Central from Burnham towards Kirwee would have a much stronger community of interest with an historic community of interest with Malvern over Ellesmere. So in my view, and option 1 fails on communities of interest, where we'd be associating people with representatives from which they have no community of interest, and that may, that's my view, and so I'm interested to hear the views of others on the community of interest test on page 35. There are the principles that we have to consider. I think we've addressed fair representation. I think either model has the numbers work, so that's fair representation. Effective representation and community of interest is the other points. So welcome to hear comments from members.
I think the other thing that you would ask yourself is, what is it about the current model that's not working that well? Because you just look at the 2 maps for options 1 and option 2. So we're focused on West Melton, but also look at the Sylvan Central ward. That's halved in geographic area, literally halved. So what is it about the current model that's the problem that we're looking to address?
Population growth.
John?
Who's that?
John?
Sorry? In answer to the Chief Executive's question, we're not unhappy with the present model, and that's the question you asked me, I think, David. We're only doing this because we've got to do it under legislation to balance the population. That's, in my view, that's the sole driver of the fact that because the population growth is so high in one area, we have to change. If we didn't have to, we wouldn't.
Mr. Chair. Whichever decision we make is a compromise. I agree with what John's just said. There's no real driver for change other than legislation. And I can see reasons why option 1 is better, and I can see reasons why option 2 is better. It just kind of depends on how you weight each of the arguments for or against each one. We're tasked with gathering as much data as we can using our own experience and positions of decision making that we've been put in to come to an outcome here, again, because legislation drives it, to put one option back out to our community through a future council meeting. And it's hard to make that decision when there's not a clear and obvious answer. So we're going to end up in a council meeting where, again, there's no particularly strong driver for one or the other. I think we could argue communities of interest both ways, for West Melton and for Springston, and for the area west of Dunsandel and the area between Rolleston and Christchurch. We've talked a lot about townships, but actually there's a number of rural people that live in between each of the townships that also, they may have children that go to a particular school, they may shop in a particular town, but when you drive past the front gate, it has another feel that is about a rural space and about what needs to happen as far as the economy and what goes on. So there's always going to be things that we could argue about. Does it represent communities of interest? And I think both option 1 and option 2 do represent communities of interest, just for different reasons. And as I've said, my preference is to get to a smaller Rolleston ward, and that's why option 1 is the choice here. But it's not that I dislike option 2 or think that it doesn't address a lot of my concerns. It's just if I'm going to weight one reason for the decision, it's the size of the urban industrial centre for Rolleston. And there's lots of arguments against that as well, and I'm hearing them this morning. But we have to choose one, and if we're squeezed into that corner where I have to come out for one, then I choose option 1.
Councillor Miller.
I guess what concerns me really is that debate seems to be centring around what's best for West Melton. There doesn't seem to be much debate, and Councillor Epper may want to join this, is about why is it okay to jam Dunsandel, Doyleston, Leeston and Southbridge up with Springs? it appears that those communities have been forgotten in this debate about what's great for West Melton, what's great for Southbridge, what's great for Leaston. And, as I said, I advocated strongly if we are going to go to 3 wards, I certainly think that option 3 is still a better ward. I'll be disappointed if we end up voting for option 2 because I think it's a suboptimal outcome for that outcome. If I have to wear amalgamation of 2 wards, I think it's a better outcome like the Mayor says. So I think we're getting very sidetracked by what's best for West Melton rather than looking what's best for all of us.
Historically, the Springs and Ellesmere wards prior to the 1989 amalgamation were Springs County, essentially. So there is historical precedence for Ellesmere and Springs being common. I believe option 2 actually gives better representation to the Ellesmere ward, what is currently the Ellesmere ward, in terms of they will be in a ward with 4 councillors. They will have more councillors to consider their issues, though we are district councillors, of course, and we should all be considering all issues for the district. So I don't actually believe they lose in the amalgamation. It was Mr. Woods, who's sitting in the background, that reminded me of that historical fact, and I thanked him at the time for that. So it's kind of a little bit of the back to the future for that region. They have a commonality of interest, in my view, much more because they share, essentially south of State Highway 1, share a very similar geography on the whole, except around the Port Hills for Taitapu. They are the lower plains area. They have a coastal boundary. They are the lower reaches of our rivers, probably inclined to flood more than the upper reaches. So I think they do have a commonality of interest between them. And I've certainly in the drop-ins and the people I spoke to could see a much stronger commonality of interest between Springs and Ellesmere than an earlier model we had, which was merged, it may not have been even this representation 6 years ago when we talked about merging Melbourne and Ellesmere. There was much less commonality of interest in that. So I focused on the community of interest of around the West Melton Township because I think that is the one that is most affected. I have not heard nor the feedback. I haven't had the feedback that the people of Ellesmere don't see a commonality with the people of Springs. In fact, it's generally promoted that the people of Ellesmere have no commonality with Melbourne and Central rather than with Springs. So, Councillor Epiar, I don't know if you have any comment about how the good people of the Ellesmere ward feel?
Yeah, there are many good people in the Ellesmere ward, Mark. Thanks very much. Yeah, look, I think we've debated this there, actually. If we're talking about representation, clearly 4 wards and 10 councillors keeps that. That's the what I've heard back from my community is that they're afraid of losing 2 ward councillors. I think 4 wards, 10 councillors addresses that. And if we're talking about communities of interest, well, 3 and 2 actually address that as well. If we're talking about what's best for our district moving forward, all of these options that are put before us actually cover everything. But we're going to have to decide on one of these options, and we're going to leave here probably not getting everything that we wanted. And that option is actually one for me.
And I just remind everybody that the subcommittee was tasked with going through a process, and I'm speaking to your point, Shane. Subcommittee was tasked with going through a process to find an option to make a recommendation back to council. We look around the room. There are 5 votes who will be at the table on the 25th. You will be joined in the conversation by 7 other councillors with a vote who have not been in the process so far. So you will articulate the reasons for your choice on the 25th. That will then go out to submission, and we'll hear the voice of West Melton, we'll hear the voice of Ellesmere and in Melbourne and Dunsandel and the other towns through that process, and that will help shape our thinking for consideration back at, what's the date, Stephen? Late October, November, that will do that. So I think it is incumbent, as I said before, option one, whilst not the unilateral favourite, is the one that still holds the most votes certainly on an STV process.
In that case, I will propose we move this motion, if there's no further debate, in two parts. Part A being that we receive the report, Part B being that the subcommittee recommends option one for the representation to council. For representation around the words "its preferred option" need to be deleted. No, yeah, those three words. Is there any further debate on that? We have mover and seconder. Seconded. All those in favour of option A, of part A, please say aye. All those in favour of part B. Opposed? No. Okay, yeah. I don't think there's a need for show of hands. I believe option it is carried as it is written. Would you like your vote against recorded, John? So option B is carried. Recommendation B. There is a further thing I think we can perhaps turn our mind to here before we move to our next item. At some point we should be considering ward names. Given the reduction in the Selwyn Central ward name, I would propose at some point that we change the name to the Ralston ward. It's not a Selwyn Central ward anymore. It's not. It's a Ralston ward. And that appeared to be the flavour of the debate. And I'm not sure whether we can just add an extra motion at some point, David, where we added in that we do have to consider ward names. I think the current ward names for Melbourne, Ellesmere and Springs would be supported by the committee, but I do not believe that in option one, the small, as shown on our maps, the small purpley pink ward is a Selwyn Central ward anymore. It is a Ralston ward. That's how it's been described by many of the members. It would more truly reflect its size and shape.
Well, procedurally, Mr. Chair, you could test the subcommittee right now by proposing that the subcommittee recommends to council that the name of Selwyn Central be changed to Ralston ward. And if you get a seconder,
I will move that.
Go to the vote.
Is there any other debate on that?
Just on the wording, we're not really changing the name of the ward. All of these are creating new wards. So the proposal is actually that there be 4 wards created, named A, B, C, D, E.
Thank you, Sam. That's very helpful. So I think that we confirm the names of the wards, recommends the names of the ward to council. The names of the wards being Malvern, Ellesmere, Springs, and Ralston.
Yeah, I like that. You moved and Grant seconded.
Moved by Councillor Miller and seconded. I move that. Seconded by Councillor Miller. If he's happy with that wording. All those in favour? Contrary? Carried. Now we move on to community boards. There's an additional paper being circulated. We now have to turn our minds, members, to community boards, and our numbers would be between 0 and 4. to take forward. Stephen, you want to lead us in?
Can I just check with Therese as to whether we have the maps? The new ones haven't come through. So we'll just circulate a set of maps. Our apologies, it was quite a bit of late night work to get the maps finished, to give you some indicative illustration of some of the proposals that are in that paper. So there are some hand-drawn notes on those, but Murray will interpret as we go through and have a look at those options. So just in terms of background, the report, the discussion document that's been circulated as the late report really looks at some of the options for community boards that the committee may wish to consider. It is a requirement that we do give consideration to community boards that's set out in the legislation, and the decision that the subcommittee has just made in terms of what it will recommend to council, I suppose helps also to inform its decision making around community board options. Murray, do you want to make any comments on the options that are in front of the community boards?
Yes, I could. Thank you. Just as you'll notice here, again, I do apologise, you're looking at the hand-drawn maps there, but what we have there is two maps that relate to this 4 wards with 10 councillors. First one there has 8 members in it, and what we've endeavoured to do was try and keep this as close as we could with the boundaries to where you are now, and that's fundamentally, it is a numbers game, as we do know. So we came to that point. With the 5 members, you'll see we're starting to move a wee bit more back out of the current location. I haven't actually got that one sitting in front of me. That's Springfield, I think, is one of the ones that moves around through there a little bit. So that's actually just trying to get it back to around about a 5-member structure there. But you could have a different sort of structure as well, but it's just trying to get the numbers to fundamentally work through that side. The 3 subdivision is really about, again, those communities of interest and seeing that a little bit differently, and I suppose that probably aligns to what you're commenting on today as well. So that's how we've looked at that, and again, we're trying to make the numbers work, so it does need to be a 3 subdivision.
On the maps where it says councillors, it means community board members.
Sorry, yes, on the on the ones that we actually have, which we haven't got printed out, they have the word community board members. That's quite right. So these are the working drafts from last night that I grabbed as I walked out the door. But we've got some nice tidier ones all done, which unfortunately don't have them here at this point.
Thank you. I think it's I put to the committee that of the wards that we've just agreed to, that it's only the Melbourne ward that perhaps would need subdivisions. That if we were to have a community board in Ellesmere and Springs, that there may not be the need for subdivisions to achieve the representation across the ward. And so looking at subdivisions is only if there is what we have to turn our mind to is the 2 parts to the question. Is there a community board in a ward? And if there were so, how do you give effective representation? In Melbourne, it has been by the use of subdivisions to ensure the community board members are represented from the different parts of the ward. And with the enlarged Melbourne ward that we just agreed to, the question would be, would West Melton be better suited by having a subdivision of its own, or be added to an existing subdivision which would have its boundaries adjusted? And so that's the question. I guess we can take it either of 2 ways. We could simplify the decision. If we were to decide we're not recommending any community boards, the discussion is finished. If we're recommending a Melbourne community board, we're not finished. Melbourne and or other community boards. So I guess it may be easiest to have a quick whip round the committee and say, what is your preference for community boards to start with? Mayor?
Again, I think it's a decision for the community to tell us whether or not they want a community board. Now that we've got down to one option, we know what the size of the wards are, and we should hear back where that sits. I think last time we went through this process, we said let's propose no community board, as I think that will generate more discussion from the community around their desire to keep one. Whereas if we say there is a community board, that may not generate the same type of discussion and feedback. So
If you look at the graphs on page 34, that would suggest that they had that of these final options that Springs, Central and Melbourne wanted community boards. Melbourne very strongly, the others not so much. Springs was quite strong.
yeah, but I think that now that there's quite a change in what the Melbourne ward looks like, actually the feedback from the ward might look slightly different than it did previously, so that would need to be taken into account. So
your preference would be, if we just quickly, just off the cuff preference for community boards is
to go to the community,
how? By having none or all?
but then tell us if you want a community board.
So you're saying the proposal should say none?
Yeah.
Jane?
Yeah, I think if I had this information in front of me before we made the decision, I probably would have favoured 3, to be honest. To me, it was around, my decision was based on representation, slightly more weight than community of interest, because that was the main concern for my constituents that I was hearing, was representation. Agree with Sam, I think we need to go to the community first and find out whether they do or don't. Ellesmere don't. We've heard that loud and clear, and that's also in the minutes here, the notes here today. Springs do. I think we need to hear loud and clear from our communities and give them options around that. Secondly, we need to figure out what delegations they're given. So what is the purpose of the community board? So we need to go to them with the option, yes or no, and then what is expected. Thank you.
John?
I would support going back with a community board for Melbourne and one for Springs.
Grant?
It's all tied up with the community committee's restructure, to be honest. My community says, why would you need a community board when we've got a really good functioning community committee? So they're sort of struggling to see why we would rate each property $30 to $50 each. They said, why don't you just give us, empower us to continue as a community committee, and we'll do what we've always done. So that's the feedback I've received. And I think probably the logical thing to do is to create. I know we've struggled with feedback, and the data says that Springs perhaps prefers a community board, but on 15 people or something, you can't make a judgment on that. It's just not enough. So I think the suggestion of going out with 0 community boards is actually at risk of inflaming the communities is actually a good thing, that should get people get off their backside and actually decide whether they want this or not.
Okay. Jenny?
To everyone's comments, I think we do need to ask the community what they feel, and it is a strong concern out there that they do still want one in Melbourne. And the other, I can see Grant's points too. If we get rid of our committees, especially with the area that we've got, I think perhaps the community board could help the councillors out. So I would go for a community board in Melbourne.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, Shane, this is much like the discussion around Māori wards. We can't offer any comment on delegations because that's the responsibility of an incoming council. And we could wish that we were able to say that we'd have a community board in each ward and they'd have a wonderful set of delegations, but we can't bind a future council to that decision. My preference, given the ward structure we've just chosen, would probably be for 3 community boards, given the removal of ward committees. The Ralston ward with 3 councillors would be well and truly overrepresented if there then also was a community board as well as a functioning Ralston Township Resident Association. So we are betwixt and between in terms of, I think it's challenging to say to the community, except for the Melbourne ward, we'll put it upon you to choose whether you want a community board, because without a strong advocate for what a community board is and can do, you don't get that choice. If there's nobody in the community going to advocate and be the driver and says the potential for a community board, the community don't have a choice. What I'm seeing in the room here today is we don't have anybody here who's wanting to be that driver. I don't believe there's anybody in the Springs, despite the voting that we're seeing in front of us, there's anybody in the Springs or Ellesmere wards with the passion and enthusiasm to drive the other side of council's debate. And in some ways, I think that if, as we've done in previous representation reviews, we say to the Melbourne ward, we do not support your community board, it does force the board itself to go out and demonstrate that support. And if they can, and it has happened previously, council has added the board back in. So I guess my preference at this stage would be probably, as Councillor Gallagher has said, given the increase in size and adding the West Melton community, urban and rural, to the Melbourne ward, that there be a community board in the Melbourne ward, so that our preferred option for community boards is one. Our recommendation is to council is that the Melbourne Community Board continue. It will face the same challenges that it currently faces. Council is unlikely to give any meaningful delegations to a community board that exists only in one ward. But if there were strong proponents for the other wards for a community board, they would have the opportunity in the month-long consultation to drive that. So I guess that's my preference, but looking at the numbers in front of us, that leaves us in a very similar position. We're almost tied again. 3 wanting no community boards and 3 supporting at least a Melbourne community board. So I seek your further comments. John.
Just for accuracy, it's not the council reinstated the community board, but there was a commission that reinstated it on appeal.
Yeah.
The council did not want it, and the community went directly to the commission to turn that around. So just so we're very clear on that.
Thank you. Brad?
I wonder, Mr. Chair, whether in some aspects we've actually failed the community of Melbourne, because we don't have any document which accurately describes the effectiveness of that board, and we haven't got any paper in front of us which describes, has the last 3, 6, 9 years of its existence been successful? Has it achieved its goals? Has it delivered what the community wants? And so probably looking in the mirror a bit, I feel that we probably haven't assisted the community board, well, without the outcome of that report being known. I don't think we have a lot of information to go on. That's the challenge I see.
I don't believe it's actually council's job to do that. I think a community board, if it is operating correctly, in my view, will have its support from its community because it is seen as effective representatives of its communities. Council could do an analysis that says it does or does not, but at the end of the day, it is its communities. And as a former Selwyn Central Ward community member, the board fell over when it lost that community support. It was seen by its community as being not representing them and not being effective. On the appeal, you are correct, John, that it was the local government commission, but I would hope that council, if in our preliminary consultation got strong support for a Melbourne community board, the council would modify its proposal before adopting the final one that would say that there is a community board. Otherwise, it leaves it open for appeal again, and that's as may happen. So, I acknowledge, Grant, there is no documentary evidence, but certainly there is anecdotal community feedback, and I've had it both ways. From as a councillor from the Melbourne ward, there are some who support the board and some who don't, and it's how we test that. If we offer an option up that says we will retain a Melbourne Community Board, is that going to test it better than saying we don't, and the board lobbies its community and shows strong evidence that there is the support for its existence? I personally, much as I support the future of the board, I think in some ways challenging the board to prove that the community supports it is the more positive affirmation. Simply saying the board can continue to exist and not giving any delegate and just leaving it at that, it will exist, but will it be effective? So I'm straddling the fence and getting splinters in my behind, and I'm just looking for a direction from the balance of the committee as to which way we might go. Sam?
I'm not hearing a strong view from the community that it shouldn't exist. So again, there's both reasons why we could go out for consultation saying keep it, and others to say we propose that discontinuing. tell us what you think. I just think that the stronger feedback will come if the proposal is across all of our wards that there be no community boards for any of them, and that will allow anyone that's in Springs or Ellesmere or proposed Rolleston ward to actually tell us, or Melbourne, to tell us that they want one. I accept that some of the feedback that we've received already shows that there are a number of people in Melbourne that want to keep it, and that's great that their voice has been heard, and those people will continue to tell us that's where it's at. I don't think that it's a review of the current board or the work that they've done. This is really just about asking the community how they want to be, how they want to represent, how they want to be represented. I don't believe that there needs to be any other subdivisions. We just don't have the data to decide whether there should be subdivisions within any of the other wards other than Melbourne. I do think there should be, if the Melbourne Community Board continues, I think there should be subdivisions continuing, particularly because we've added West Melton as a potential to their ward. And so I'm interested in the two maps that we've got, and one has 5 councillors and 5 members, and a breakdown of 2, 2 and 1 between the reds, 2 for red, 2 for blue and 1 for yellow. But I just don't have a breakdown for the other map, and is that 3, 3, 2, 3? I'm just guessing. Can you just let us know what the numbers are in the 8-member option? Because I think if we're going to go to the community, we would have to put forward one option.
2 in yellow, 3 in blue and red.
Is that? It's in the report. Oh, it's in the report, sorry, not on the map. So if we're picking between those, I think the 5-member option needs to be included in the consultation.
So is that equally true for the other wards as well? That we were saying at the moment we propose no community board, but if there was to be one, it would have X members.
I think we should provide some direction on that. I don't think we've got any data to suggest there should be subdivisions within any of the other wards though. But if we got some feedback on that, let's take that into account. But a community board of about 5 rather than of about 10, I think is a good number.
So some advice come back from the Remuneration Authority in respect to community boards. So the first question that the community will have, well, what will the board members do and what will they be paid? So a couple of things you've got to consider. In terms of remuneration, the Remuneration Authority have requested that if councils decide that there is going to be boards, they require the following information: the name of the board area, the population that's being served, the proposed number of members, the additional responsibility or powers that council are going to delegate to those boards, and proposed additional remuneration. And the Remuneration Authority itself will then take those things into consideration and will advise no later than the 11th of April next year what the remuneration will be. So I think coming back to Sam's area, it would be easier at this stage if the proposal was either A, retention of the status quo, or B, no boards, but where you get into the other boards, you need a wider conversation.
There any further discussion?
I was going to say the other thing is that if you look at, so we've already voted on option 1. So if you align a board with option 1, there's a fair chunk of the population that currently aren't represented by a board will be entering into the conversation. Do we need a board or not? And so option 1 talks about Melbourne board 14,900 and option 4 10,800. So 4,000 people coming in.
Some of those shifting from Central to Melbourne were represented by a community board
6 years ago.
and did not 6 years ago and did not support the retention of that board.
That's true.
So they have experience with that experience. So getting back to where we're at, do we go in option B of the recommendation with essentially the status quo, a continuation of Melbourne? Do we go with recommending no community boards in the model and seeing how it comes out in the consultation period, or do we suggest some other model? I'm still trying to look for an indication from the committee as to where it lands. The preferences I had before, as I say, landed three either way for continuing Melbourne. Has anybody reconsidered their view? Anybody who didn't want to continue with the Melbourne board change their mind?
Yeah, my view around before wasn't whether we should keep it or not. It's what question do we want answered by our community to give us the best steer on the final decision that we get to. So
put to each ward, do you want a community board?
Yeah, leave it as an open question. We then receive the feedback and we can insert the desired outcome there. I just hope that we get more than 50 people tell us what they want, because with 14,000 people now in the Melbourne ward under the proposed new model, I would want to hear from a significant number of people from any of the wards, should we include them. And just highlight again what the CEO has mentioned there. There's no rational, consistently applied rationale for community boards across the country. So what we're determined to do is to look out for what does the community of Selwyn want and what does then the community within any ward want, rather than applying a national standard to us.
So Stephen and Murray, you have the speaker on down there.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that the process doesn't really allow us to go out with an open question. We have to have a proposal that says this is what we are proposing, and that proposal must either include or not include community board or boards.
And would our proposal actually, if we were to go out with an option that said no community boards, actually have to propose to disestablish the Melbourne Community Board?
Yeah. It's correct.
So, so our recommendation really has to be either that we disestablish the Melbourne Community Board, or we continue with the Melbourne Community Board and establish community boards in the other wards that we want to. Is that how it should read?
Mr. Chair.
It does have to propose a firm position one way or the other, but we also do have the opportunity in the consultation information to provide information to the community about role, costs, or the associated background on community boards to help inform their feedback to the council.
John.
Well, now we've circulated around the carcass and had a couple of snaps here and there. I think we're now down to it. That in reality, there's no support around these tables for community boards, full stop. I am supporting a community board in Melbourne, which is the status quo, but I'm not going to support community boards in the other wards. That's a whole change of direction. So to me, the question, you're simply going, or you're going to vote, and you seem to be focused on forcing the community to step up is that you either vote here today that the community board in Melbourne continues, or you disestablish it. Now, if that's the case, then what you're saying, if you use the second part of my statement, you have an expectation the community will lobby or make a submission to council that they wish it to be retained. And so that therefore will be reviewed again after that submission. Still meaning that the community has the right, irrespective of council's decision, to go to the commission, and that's a given. So for me, it's either a continuation of the community board in Melbourne, or it's not. The others, I don't think there's any support for boards.
So are you recommending something, John, to get the debate going?
Okay, well, I'll recommend that the community board in Melbourne remain. Is that the right words? Or
Not for other wards.
but not for other wards?
Grant?
Why that one?
You want to second it?
Well, okay. Is there a seconder for part 12? So, well, we haven't got a seconder for the entire motion at the moment, and I rather than seek a mover and a seconder, because I think we've got parts A and B, it would be to seek comment from the committee before we formally move it as to whether there is support for John's recommendation, part B.
Well, you can do that, but I'll put a recommendation and you're obligated to serve as a seconder. If it's not, well, then there's no point in discussing.
All right. Is there a seconder for the recommendations as they stand, A and B? Jenny has seconded it. Is there further debate on the recommendations? Does not recommend, probably not, in that the second part should say does not recommend any other committee ought to be established. Grant?
I'd like us to take some time here to hear some feedback from Jenny and the chair over there, who have been past members and current members of that committee, because you're down to brass tacks. My personal observation of it from the outside, and again I stand to be corrected, and I may well be, is that the delegations and the ability for that group to achieve a hang of a lot are limited. And why have that ongoing when the outcomes from it seem to be poor? So perhaps what I'm saying is convince me that it is a great organisation that is really, you look at the numbers there that the councillors will be servicing, even if it goes up to 14,000, it's 7,000 people a councillor. If you compare it perhaps to Christchurch or Waimakariri or some of those other councils, that you're talking 40 to 50,000 per councillor. So I would suggest that the local councillors would be better served, and perhaps as all of us would be better served by having a different model of service for our own communities. I think the drop-in clinics have been successful, and the digital enabling of our community to use digital technology, particularly Zoom and other technologies, to communicate not only with their councillor but also with the council. So I guess I'm open to being convinced, but here's the opportunity if you want to.
Is it worth the effort, or are you unconvincible?
I'm open to convincing.
Okay. The reasons for the community board in Melbourne haven't really changed, and they're built on history. And if you look at why the community has gone back to the commission when council has twice before tried to disestablish the community board, has always been about large area, large isolation, a number of small towns, and the fact that of trying to serve that area in a democratic way. Now you've just increased the size of the ward with an even bigger population. You've disestablished township committees, and now you've made a decision at the council table. So not only do you don't have the feedback from them, so now, in my view, you've probably got an even better argument for having a community board, because you've still got a large rural area, you've got an increased population, and you want to see that community represented. I look at the other wards. Of course, you don't need a community board in Rolleston. You can walk around your ward just about in half a day. I take a drive as a councillor to go to Arthur's Pass or Castle Hill, whatever it is. It all takes time. So if you believe in the concept of community boards, And I'm not going to touch on the subject of delegation and their worthfulness, because that's all about how council views them. And council basically has seen the Melbourne Community Board as a pain in the ass, and it's never delegated or given it any decent roles. Now that's a problem with the system, which is very disappointing. Made the role of that board probably very hard to really represent its community, but it has survived, and it's still valued by its community, isn't it? And here we are, and I'm representing that community.
Jenny, have you any comment?
John's made some good points with the committees going, and that too is my concern. But we need the community board to get out and work with the communities and their committees. So, yeah, with making all the other decisions around the committees, especially in the geographical size of the ward, I think we do need to consider still keeping the board.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair. Sure. Just for clarification, the disestablishment of the Melbourne Community Board that was put in place by a commissioner can be disestablished by council. Is that correct?
They're going to be approached by this commissioner. Yeah, there's two ways to disestablish a community board. The board can decide to disestablish itself, or a representation review can recommend to its council. The recommendation review process can disestablish a community board. The process is subject to consultation and then subject to the opportunity to appeal to the local government commission.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Thanks, mate. I respect John's cordial just then, and what he's spoken about is the historical community board, and what we're facing now is the future. And we've got other forms of connection today with Zoom and digital experience. What I'm really interested to understand is whether there is a need. We've got a growing population. We're the fastest growing district in just about New Zealand now. We need to understand from the community whether it's something they want, and I think that's easily done with an opinion poll that doesn't cost much at all. I think if we're going to be brutally honest about it, if we're choosing, and from my community, from the Ellesmere community, they don't see the benefit in being rated for a community board that the council to do work that the council should be doing anyway. And on that, if we're voting no for community boards, then it has to be across the board. So I'd support that.
I'm not clear what you supported or opposed B, but we'll come to that when we vote on it. If option B passes, part B passes in its current form, we will have to then consider part C as to the subdivisions within the ward. I'm just foreshadowing that there's one piece of work to do afterwards. If we support if the committee supports option recommendation B as it is currently written, then there is a recommendation C as to the subdivisions within the Melbourne ward for their community board. It may be more practical simply to have the vote on those two options as they stand, and if recommendation B passes, that we then turn our minds to the maps we've had in front of us showing a potential subdivision, because we would have to go out with that to council and to the community. So,
can I ask a question of clarification?
Yes, certainly can.
Stephen, does the community board have to cover all of a ward, or can it cover part of the ward? And the reason for asking is because we've already heard from Selwyn Central 6 years ago that West Melbourne didn't want, well, Selwyn Central at the time, West Melbourne included, didn't want a community board. Could we propose that the community board remain covering the area that it currently does as an option, rather than increasing it to the full ward? Because there may be quite a split view within the community. If West Melbourne made a decision 6 years ago to get rid of them and the current Melbourne community wants to keep them, then how do we make a decision?
I have to seek some clarification, Mr. Chairman, but I don't believe that's possible. My first recollection of the guidance is that the community board would cover the ward area, and then there's the question as to the subdivisions which would make up that coverage.
I concur with that.
And Mr. Chair, can I just get one more clarification, please? So if we were to go out to public with options and subdivisions, we would need to clearly go with a name, an area, population, members, delegation, and remuneration.
Not delegations, not remuneration. Those are both decisions not for this committee. Remuneration is set by the Remuneration Authority. Delegations will be set by the council after the 2022 elections. All we can do is go out with a recommendation. It is correct. You are in fact very correct. Thank you, councillor, that if we go with a subdivision option which has a third subdivision that doesn't exist today, we'd have to throw a name at it. So that would be part of recommendation C that we'll get to if recommendation B passes. So is there any other debate from members?
Why don't we just knock these off A, B?
So having had a mover and seconder, I'll put to the meeting option A, recommendation A. Those in favour?
Aye.
Contrary, carried. Recommendation B.
Aye.
Those in favour?
Aye.
Contrary, I'm going to call division. I'd like to see a show of hands for option B, because I think that wasn't a clear voice. So for those in favour as option B, as we see on the screen, please raise your hand.
We have 1, 2,
Carried.
3, 4, 5, 6. It's unanimous.
Carried. So we now turn our minds to the subdivisions within the enlarged Melbourne ward. I'll kick it off. Of the maps we have in front of us,
1B.
I prefer the one that has a subdivision for the West Melton area, because
I support you.
which is option C, 5 community board members, 2 from the red, and call that West Melton subdivision.
I don't support that.
2 from the Hawkins subdivision, and 1 from Tawera.
You're moving in that direction.
I don't support that.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to have that as a movement, and the motion probably needs to say with members 2, 2, and 1 respectively, or something along those lines. Or as you were doing, that's fine. Yeah. John.
Well, if you truly believe in community boards, and community boards are representative of your community at the community level, I far would sooner see the option of 233, which is the top of page, and is that's option 1B. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Sorry. Option 1B is what I prefer, because you're having added that, and that would truly represent that population of West Melton.
Okay. Other members' preferences? I'm happy to take that advice.
Too many.
Sorry?
Too many.
You'll prefer 1C, Grant? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so.
Just remind you, if you go with 1B, you're talking 8 community board members plus 2 councillors. So it would be 10 people in total, which is exactly the same as you've got around the council table.
Jenny? 1C. Sam? Shane?
But can I ask, just because the maps aren't particularly clear of what townships are included,
The next map's better.
yeah, it's hard to make a decision today, not quite knowing where Springfield, like where the divisions, you've mentioned Springfield, is that in the blue, is that in the yellow, where does Glen Tunnel, Colgate, Hororata?
I think the reference to Springfield was wrong. It was Sheffield that was talked about being moved, not Springfield.
It'd be Sheffield, sorry, I mixed the two.
From the yellow to the blue.
Yes, it's just that wee area just in there, but sorry, I can't answer on Colgate and those sort of ones. So.
Okay, and on names, I think if we're going to call one West Melton, neither Hawkins nor Tawera have the same
Relevance.
No.
Have you other names to suggest? I mean, we could pick names up when it comes to recommendation at council in a fortnight's time.
Yeah, let's maybe ask John to consult with the community board as they are now, who know the area. I'm thinking about some names to come back with the Melbourne councillors, but I just think if we're going to go with the name of a town for one of the wards, then that doesn't necessarily mean that Hawkins and Tawera cold to say, but or we think of a different name for the rest.
But I think we could pick that up at the recommendation, amend the recommendation to council. It can be deemed a working title for now. So given, is there any further debate, or shall we put recommendation C? I moved it. Was there a seconder for it? Mr. Councillor Miller, all those in favour? Recommendation C as it stands on essentially that's the option 1C for the membership of the Melbourne Community Board. All those in favour? All right. Contrary? Would you like that recorded? Carried. Is there any further business? Thank you, members, for your work and your discussion. Do we meet again as a committee, or is this it?
This is it. Yeah.
So thank you for your work over this process and your input. And yeah, would you like to finish with Karakia, Shane, at all, or we just? All right, I will go back to my list of Karakia that I had at the start of the meeting. There is one that we've had as a councillor before, which is Uniha ki te ruru tapu nui, ti waitea, ti mama, ti nakau, ti tina, ti wairua, I te ara ta kita. Koe ra i rongo, whakaaria aki ki ronga, kia tina, tine, hue takie.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks everybody.